Now, we'll talk about that right now with former House Speaker Newt Gingrich. Congresswoman Kathy McMorris Rodgers is with us, and Congressman Jeb Hensarling talking about rules and regulations. Plus, what is the state of our nation's cybersecurity? Are we prepared for attacks at home and abroad? We'll talk with the former head of National Security Agency. General Keith Alexander is with us as we look ahead on Sunday Morning Futures. And for more on the Trump transition, with me right now, Newt Gingrich, former Speaker of the House, author of Treason, and a Fox News contributor. Mr. Speaker, good to see you again. Thanks so much for joining us.
Well, it's great to be back with you.
Broadly speaking, how would you characterize the transition so far? We had a great conversation last week with Steve Mnuchin and Wilbur Ross, who seem very much focused on priorities of tax reform and rolling back regulations. But broadly characterize what we've seen so far.
Well, I think President-elect Trump has, first of all, been very methodical and has looked at absolutely first-class people. And I think generally has picked people who are going to be tough and intelligent and have a lot of experience. I think, for example, that his choice of Betsy DeVos for education is just remarkably powerful, because she has spent years of her life fighting for the right of poor children in neighborhoods with bad schools to have the choice of going to a better school. And she has spent a great deal of her own personal money in this crusade to help poor children. So you could hardly have a better person at the Secretary of Education. I think at the same time that Elaine Chao's ability to understand the federal government to bring people together will make her a very important Secretary of Transportation at a time when a very large infrastructure program is going to be a key part of the Make America Great Jobs program that Trump is in favor of. So I look around. General Mattis is as good as anybody I've worked with in the Defense Department in the last 30 years. He is a remarkable person. I am delighted they could talk him into doing it because he's a total patriot, and he will bring a very calm, very measured approach to that job. He is very respected across the entire defense establishment. And Congress has to pass a waiver, but I'm confident it'll go through with virtually no opposition because Jim Mattis is such a remarkable guy. So I look at what he's done up till now. Wilbur Ross is a brilliant guy and knows how business works, has proven it himself. Steve Mnuchin was described to me as one of the smartest finance people in the world. And the Treasury Secretary is an operational job. You got to make it work every single day. It's not theoretical. And Mnuchin, I think, will bring great experience and great intelligence to making that job work.
The idea that Donald Trump is tweeting this morning about companies leaving the country and there will be consequences. Newt, there's some debate about that. I understand making America, the most favorable place to do business and making the tax code so attractive that you don't want to leave. But to warn companies that there will be consequences, do you worry about this kind of tone?
No, I don't, because I think he's trying to jar the system. I think, he hasn't gone out and saying, I'm going to pick on you individually. He's saying, look, there's a class of behavior here which we're going to have a response to. And we're sending a signal that this is going to be different. And it is going to be different. This is something people better get in their heads. He's going to intervene. Every governor in the country intervenes in order to keep factories in their state, or intervenes in order to convince somebody to invest and build a factory in their state. Well, Trump understands what the governors understand, which is we are in a worldwide competition with Mexico, with China, with other countries. And he's going to work very hard to figure out, and this is part of why he picked Wilbur Ross and he picked Steve Mnuchin, he wants to figure out how do we create an environment in which it is so desirable to be in the U.S. and, by the way, so expensive not to be in the U.S. So I expect to see them take some steps to make it harder to import and easier to export as part of their general strategy.
Right. And that's what he said in the tweet this morning, basically saying there will be a tax on our soon-to-be strong border of 35% for those companies who leave the country, produce goods overseas, like in Mexico, much cheaper, and then try to get those products back into the U.S.
And the only question is, does that tax apply to everybody? So if you're a Toyota or you're a Mercedes or whatever, are you also going to pay that tax? I suspect the tax will apply to all imports. And at the same same time, I suspect he's going to create a rebate. So if you're the Mercedes plant in Alabama, you're going to get money back if you ship your cars out of the country. But if you're the Mercedes plant in Stuttgart, you're going to pay a tax to get your cars into the U.S.
But isn't that 35% potential tariff the one thing that business and individuals were afraid of about his trade talk during the campaign, Newt? I mean, isn't that what we've been worried about? And then he said he was just going to use it as a tool. Is it just a tool and a threat? Or are we going to see a real disruption in terms of our trading partners with this potential tariff?
Well, look, I think this again goes to the heart of Trumpism and why he was elected. We're running $600 and $800 billion a year deficits. Well, if you cut that in half, that means that you have disrupted a number of countries. If you actually turn it into a surplus over the next 10 years, you have really disrupted a number of countries. Now, the question is, do you want to keep running huge deficits and costing American jobs, but having cheaper products? Or are you prepared to pay a little bit more for imported products, but have dramatically more American jobs? This is a very disruptive moment in American history. And so far, the sentiment both in the Congress and in the presidential election, I mean, even Secretary Clinton was against the trade deal she'd been in favor of because she found it was politically unsustainable.
Yeah, no, you make a great point. Let me move on to Taiwan. What do you make of this, Mr. Speaker? I mean, he says that she called him and that, of course, I'm going to take the call to answer the congratulations tone. But this is being looked at as a real pushback and a message to China. How do you see it?
I love this. I love this at every level. First of all, I like the idea that if the freely elected leader of 23 million people, this is the third time that the Taiwanese have had an election in which the opposition party has won. So they actually have a genuine free government. This is the first woman elected in her own right without having a husband or a father who was president before her. She's a totally legitimate figure, so she calls you. Now, under the old establishment, the old timid State Department, the old rules, we would have turned down the phone call on the grounds we didn't want to offend the dictatorship in Beijing. Trump said, hey, if she wants to talk to me, I'll talk to her. He hasn't made any diplomatic gestures except he's actually talked with the freely elected leader of a country. Now, the second thing I like about this is it cuts straight across all of the State Department ideas. Nick Burns, who's a big guy in the State Department for years, said, I'm afraid Trump is not listening to the State Department. And I tweeted, I hope not. We elected him not to listen to the current State Department. Lastly, it's a good signal to the Chinese. Beijing does not dictate who an American president speaks to. And they need to be under no illusions. Donald Trump is different. He's not hostile to China. But at the same time, he's not going to kowtow and do what the Chinese want. And this was a very inexpensive, very low-key way of communicating that.
Yeah, but at the same time, China is responding. And are we going into the new presidency with an already hostile tone to a country that is supposed to be one of our most important allies, China?
Well, I mean, they're not our most important, one of our most important allies. The Chinese currently are trying to establish control over several islands in the North China Sea, where they're claiming the right to establish an air corridor that they will control. They're inventing islands in the South China Sea where they're trying to establish a claim of sovereignty over the entire region. We need to be clear. The Chinese they're not our enemies, but they are our natural competitors right now. They're behaving like competitors. And I think that we don't need to go into some kind of Cold War, but we need to be calmly and cheerfully firm that the United States, in fact, is not automatically going to do what Beijing wants it to do.
Yeah, and of course, this is going to be a job also for his next Secretary of State. Do you expect that position to be announced this week? There was a report yesterday that now Romney and Giuliani are out. What's your take on who's going to take that role?
Let me tell you something. I've learned spending the last 2 years studying Donald J. Trump, and I've known him for many years, but starting in January of last year, Clifton and I talked to him about running, and ever since we paid pretty careful attention. No one knows. There's only one person who knows who's going to be Secretary of State. That person may not yet have made their mind up. When they do, it'll be the person they want. It could be Giuliani. It could be Romney. It could be Petraeus. It could be Senator Corker. It could be Ambassador John Bolton. There are lots of talented people out there. What I'm impressed with, and I hope everybody will take note of this has been his hardest decision. for a lot of different reasons. It's a very hard job to fill right now because each guy has strengths but also has weaknesses. And what's been impressive to me is his patience in methodically, calmly going through this. He knows that some of us are deeply opposed to Romney. That hasn't stopped him. He knows that there are some people who are very strongly in favor of Romney. That hasn't automatically moved him. He knows that Giuliani has many supporters. I'm one of them. That doesn't automatically get him anything. So I've admired the very deliberate, very calm way in which Trump has gone through this. He's been very methodical. As you know, I'm not a fan of Romney's, but if they've had several long meetings and they've had several deep conversations, and with this call from Taiwan, for example, I think Trump is indicating both how central he will be to relations around the world and that he's not going to be the State Department's automatic puppet. I think in that kind of a setting, whoever he ends up picking is somebody I'll support, because I think Trump is the person who has to have a vision of his administration and his cabinet.
Yeah. And
he deserves some respect for having really very methodically worked this problem.
Yeah, it's really extraordinary what's happening before the inauguration. So much activity. Mr. Speaker, great to see you as always. Thanks so much.
Good to be with you.
Always a pleasure. Newt Gingrich there. President-elect Trump is not skipping a beat when it comes to working with Congress, meanwhile. So what can we expect from January and beyond? We will talk with